On this episode of the Athletic Acuity Sports Podcast, I'm going to be going over NFC team over-unders and bets that I like for the 2020 NFL season. I'm recording this on July 15th in the morning, just in case any NFL news surfaces. And there will be a twin podcast to this one going over AFC team over-unders and bets that I like, if you're interested in this kind of thing. So I'm going to start out with the NFC West, starting out with the San Francisco 49ers. Their over-under is 10.5. So my initial reaction is that this is a pretty big number for a team that is in a pretty difficult division. I liked the 49ers a lot more than most people did going into last season, and I like them a lot less than people do going into this season. I think under 10.5 is the right play. I think this 49ers team is going to be more offensive oriented rather than defensive oriented going into this 2020 season. I think offensively this team will be fine. Kyle Shanahan is one of the best play designers in the NFL. I think Jimmy Garoppolo is a good and somewhat underrated quarterback. I think he's pretty clearly one of the 10 or 12 best quarterbacks in the NFL. It's no coincidence that this team is substantially better with Garoppolo rather than some of the other backups that they've had to play in the Shanahan era. But I'm going under on this team at 10.5 despite liking the offense. I think the weaponry is fine. I'm not afraid of the fact that they've lost Emmanuel Sanders. I like Deebo Samuel a lot, even though he might miss some time. Brandon Ayuk, I think, will fit in well. And Jalen Hurd is someone we didn't get to see last year. Dante Pettis is a guy that we haven't gotten to see much. They have a good offensive line, and George Kittle is one of the best individual players in the NFL. Defensively, this team was outstanding last year. I think the front seven will continue to be dominant, but I think their secondary will probably regress. A lot of different guys played really well last year. Richard Sherman, Ahkello Witherspoon, K'Wan Williams, Jimmy Ward. If 2 or 3 of those 4 regress a little bit and this team defensively just is closer to being an above average rather than elite defense, I think it will make a difference for this team in terms of their win total. The other thing about this team to keep in mind is that, Seattle's got a really good quarterback. Arizona seems to be improved. The Rams are still reasonable. I think this division is difficult, and I think that this conference is difficult. The Niners actually have a pretty difficult schedule. I'm going to throw out 2 other bets for the Niners, aside from under 10.5 wins. They're plus 330 to miss the playoffs. I don't think it's likely, but I think that sprinkling a little bit on that makes some sense. The way that they would miss the playoffs is probably if a couple of surprise teams end up really good and maybe one of them is in their division. Otherwise, it would be Garoppolo getting injured again. And despite liking plus 330 to miss the playoffs, I also see a little bit of value on Jimmy Garoppolo 50-1 to win MVP. I think in most simulations of reality, this Niners team is probably a pretty good team, at the very least. They are in a crowded NFC, but if this team exceeds my expectations and wins a lot of games like they did last year, Jimmy Garoppolo is probably going to be the quarterback of a pretty darn efficient offense on a good team. And so Garoppolo 50-1 to win MVP, I just think if you sprinkle a tiny bit on that, it makes some sense. I think that's a positive expected value type of bet. I think more realistically, I would say Garoppolo should be maybe 35-40-1, somewhere in that range. So moving on to the Seahawks. Their over-under is at 9.5. And I like the over. The same reason why I like betting on the Chiefs all the time is the reason why I'm going to lean a little bit towards Seattle. Of course, the difference between the Chiefs and the Seahawks is that despite both teams having great quarterbacks, the Chiefs have a really smart coaching staff. The Seahawks, well, they like to run the ball a lot and take the ball out of Wilson's hands. But at 9.5, I'm still going to go with the over. Wilson is firmly the second best quarterback in the NFL. I think he's been outstanding. I don't always love the way the Seahawks try to build their rosters. I don't always like the way they draft, but if they have Wilson, I'm going to give him a chance. And to go along with Wilson, Tyler Lockett and DK Metcalf are very good downfield weapons for this offense, and I think they complement Wilson's ability to throw the ball deep very nicely. Another bet I'm going to throw out there, the Seahawks are plus 260 to win the NFC West. I really like that. I think this team could very easily win this division. They have the best quarterback in this division. And to go along with that, Russell Wilson plus 600 to win MVP. It's going to be difficult for Wilson to be better than Patrick Mahomes for a full season if both stay healthy, but at plus 600, if you just put a tiny bit down on that, I think it's a worthwhile bet. You're getting, you can bet Mahomes and Wilson both to win MVP. Mahomes is at plus 400, Wilson at plus 600. You're covering a lot of ground by taking pretty clearly the two best quarterbacks in the NFL. So I like that bet. The third team in this division is the LA Rams. Their over-under is 8.5. So I am on the under for this Rams team. I think there's a pretty good chance that the Rams have the worst head coach quarterback combination in this division. Even though it's not a bad head coach quarterback combination, this division is really loaded right now. The other thing about the Rams is that I think they've made a lot of mistakes with building their roster in the past 2 years. They're pretty far removed from where they were when they went to the Super Bowl. They've just totally given up on the idea of replenishing their roster with draft capital. They've been given out first round picks like it's nothing. I think Jalen Ramsey's a super talented player. I don't think there's a non-quarterback in the NFL who I would give up 2 first-round picks for. A first-round pick is super valuable because you're getting your choice at what is supposed to be one of the better prospects coming in at a cheap contract. That's kind of the catch. The Rams have been in cap space trouble. They haven't replenished their roster with draft picks, so they've lost depth and cap space. To go along with that, they're suffering from the Todd Gurley contract, and I guess they didn't learn their lesson because the first thing they do in the 2020 draft is they take a running back. So, I don't know. I think this team has made a lot of questionable decisions. They gave away Marcus Peters for practically nothing. I think this team's offensive line, for me, is pretty firmly in the bottom third of the NFL. I think that 4 of their 5 starters are definitely below average and potentially like fringe backup type players. And to go along with that, their best offensive lineman, Andrew Whitworth, is 38 years old. I still like Robert Woods and Cooper Kupp, but, McVay's offense has become a little bit stale, and I think Jared Goff is the worst quarterback in this division. I would rather bet on Kyler Murray being better than him in this upcoming season. I think Garoppolo is better than him. And, defensively, they don't have a ton of depth. They have a few, impact players like Donald and Jalen Ramsey. I don't hate their secondary. I think Troy Hill is a pretty good second corner. David Long is a guy I liked in the 2019 draft. They've stashed him on their roster. But overall, I think this Rams team could very easily finish 4th in this division. They're minus 105 to miss the playoffs. That's almost even money. not only do I like under 8.5 wins, but minus 105 to miss the playoffs. Even if there's 7 playoff teams, the Rams, pretty clearly don't have one of the 7 best rosters in the NFC. And I don't think that they have one of the 7 best quarterbacks either. So I am pretty down on the Rams going into this year. Finally, we have the Arizona Cardinals. Their over-under is 7.5. So 7.5 is, a pretty big number for a team that won 5.5 games because of the tie last year. I really like what the Cardinals have been doing. I think Cliff Kingsbury and Steve Keim as a combination have been one of the most savvy front office, decision-making groups in the NFL since they came together. I thought the decision to move off of Josh Rosen and move on to Kyler Murray was the right one to make, even though it wasn't, totally obvious at the time. And I liked a lot of their picks in the 2019 draft with Byron Murphy, even though he didn't play well in his first season. And in this 2020 offseason, they made probably the best trade that I've evaluated in recent memory. They get rid of David Johnson's contract, and they get DeAndre Hopkins, one of the 5 best receivers in the NFL. All they had to do was give up a second-round pick for it. To go along with that, I thought Isaiah Simmons was one of the 4 best prospects in the 2020 draft. They got him at 8. And they took Josh Jones, who I thought could have been a late first-round pick, and they got him in the early 3rd round. So, they made a lot of good decisions this offseason. I think they got a lot better. The question will be if 7.5 is pushing it a little bit too quickly. I'm wondering if this team is better in the 2021 season than in the 2020 season. Kyler Murray was decent but not amazing in his first year. He took too many sacks, but that's something that could get better as he starts to adjust to the speed of the NFL. I'm going to lay off of the 7.5 over-under for Arizona, but there are some other bets for the Cardinals that I like. They're plus 185 to make the playoffs. I think the Cardinals have a lot of boom or bust associated with them. If this team is really good, the best version of this team probably makes the playoffs in the NFC. I think that the best version of this team is where Kyler Murray takes a big step. Cliff Kingsbury, who was probably an underrated play caller last year, helps out Murray's development. DeAndre Hopkins makes a big impact, and this is a very offensive-oriented team that outscores their opponents. To go along with that, defensively, maybe a guy like Isaiah Simmons makes a big difference for them. He can play all over the place. And maybe someone like Byron Murphy plays better in his second year. I think the pathway for Arizona to be really good is pretty visible. I just think that, there are some ways for it to not go correctly. And part of it is that they're in a tough division and a tough conference. So plus 185 to make the playoffs, I think, is a really good bet for Arizona. The last thing I'll throw out there is that they're plus 700 to win this division. It is a long shot, but I do think that plus 700 is, a slight positive expected value type of bet. I think that Arizona could be a really good team if everything aligns for them. So overall, I'm a little bit higher on the Cardinals than most people, but I would probably stay away from 7.5. That is a tall order for a team that only won 5.5 games last year. All right, moving to the NFC South. The Saints are at 10.5 for their over-under. This is a no play for me. They've won 13 games in each of the past 2 seasons, but I think this division is going to be better than it has been in the past couple of years. So I think the Saints are going to be a good team again. I just don't like the number 10.5. It's a pretty tall order for this team. I don't feel super comfortable going with or against it. But I do think the Saints will be a good team going into this 2020 season. Tampa Bay at 9.5 is the first team I'll start to talk about. So initially when I saw 9.5, I thought Tom Brady is going to be 43 going into this year. I'm wondering if this bet makes sense. I looked at their roster a little bit more, and then I looked at their schedule. I think the Buccaneers are probably going to go over this number. So I'm going to lean slightly towards the over. It is juiced heavily towards the over, so you're going to have to pay to play with that number, but I'm going to go slight over on 9.5. I wouldn't put a ton down on it. I just think this team, not only having an easy schedule, but just having this good of a roster, it's going to be tough for them to not win a lot of games. The only way this all goes south is if Brady just falls off, which is possible, but if he's close to what he was last year, I think this team will be pretty good. Looking at their offense, Chris Godwin, Mike Evans, along with their 5th-round pick Tyler Johnson, I think this offense has some of the best weapons in the NFL. They have 3 different tight ends. Even though Arians doesn't usually incorporate tight ends very much into his offense, I think that, O.J. Howard could line up outside. He could line up in the slot. I think that they could do some creative things with the amount of weapons that they have. The offensive line is pretty solid. It's capable, close to average, maybe a little better than that. It's just not a liability, which is important. Brady is also good at getting the ball out quickly, so he protects his offensive linemen a lot. I thought that Tristan Wirfs pick was a really good one. I tentatively had Wirfs as my favorite offensive tackle in the class, so the fact that they got him at 13 was a pretty good pick. I also think Tampa Bay defensively has one of the most underrated defenses in the NFL. This defense gave up a lot of points last year, in large part because Jameis Winston turned it over a lot and the defense was put in tough spots a lot. And, Brady probably is going to run the offense a lot differently than Jameis did. This offense will probably be less downfield oriented because Jameis is probably the most downfield oriented passer in the NFL. But to go along with that, there will probably be a lot fewer turnovers and there will be less pressure on this defense. I really like this secondary. Carlton Davis, Jamel Dean as the outside corners, Sean Murphy-Bunting as a slot corner, and Antoine Winfield Jr., a 2nd-round pick by the Bucs in the 2020 draft. I thought he was worth a late 1st-rounder to play safety. I think this secondary is one of the most underrated in the NFL, and let's not forget, Bruce Arians is a very smart head coach. I would trust him to be a general manager. I would trust him as a head coach. He did a very good job of assembling a very talented secondary in Arizona when he put together the Patrick Peterson, Antonio Cromartie, Tyrann Mathieu trio on those really good Cardinals teams. So I trust this team. I think that 9.5, I'm leaning slightly towards the over for the Bucs. Next up, we have Atlanta. The Falcons over-under is 7.5. The case for the Falcons being good this year is that they're going to have a really good, efficient passing offense once again, which they've had for really almost the entire Matt Ryan tenure in Atlanta. And the other case for Atlanta is that you can say, well, Tom Brady is 43. Drew Brees is 41. Matt Ryan is only 35. And Matt Ryan wasn't too dissimilar from either of those other two guys over the past couple of seasons. So there's a case to be made that Matt Ryan could have the best, or certainly the second best season of the quarterbacks in this division. To go along with the case for the Falcons, you have to assume the offensive line is going to regress and get better. You have to assume the secondary on defense is going to be better than it was. The defense as a whole will get better. A lot of assumptions to make. The case against Atlanta is that some classic Falcons thing happens where everybody gets injured and the team, despite maintaining somehow a pretty good passing offense, just goes like with a 4-12 record or something like that. I think 7.5 is the right number for this team, so I'm not going to go over or under on the Falcons. I don't really see a huge edge on either side. What I do like about the Falcons is they're plus 210 to make the playoffs. So there's going to be 7 teams in each conference that make the playoffs this year. The Falcons, I think, might have not only one of the 7 best quarterbacks in the NFC, but one of the 7 best quarterbacks in the NFL. To go along with that, they're going to probably have one of the 7 best passing efficiency offenses in the NFL. I think plus 210 to make the playoffs is where you'd want to go if you want to bet on the Falcons. Okay, and finally, we have the Carolina Panthers. They're listed at 5.5 in most places. I found them at 6 on certain websites. I'm under on this Panthers team. I think this Panthers team is going to be really bad, and I think that they're probably tanking and keeping their eyes on Trevor Lawrence and Justin Fields. I think Teddy Bridgewater is conservative enough of a quarterback to tank with. Bridgewater is one of the most conservative quarterbacks in the NFL. He does not like throwing the ball downfield. He's reasonably precise in the underneath stuff. He's a reasonably good decision maker, but if your team is down by 10 in like the third quarter, there's a pretty good chance Bridgewater isn't going to be the guy to rescue your team. Also, in that stretch of games he played with the Saints last year, I think like 3 or 4 of those games were really close, like within 7 points of a victory. So the fact that he went undefeated with the Saints last year, I think is being overblown a little bit. Like, there were a few different games that finished where the Saints won by 3 or fewer points. So, I don't necessarily think that that record that he had last year as a starter was super stable. I think this offense is going to be really weak. The offensive line is about average. McCaffrey's a really good player, but McCaffrey specializes in underneath stuff. And, if your best player is just running underneath routes, you're not really stretching the field very much. Their 2 best receivers are Robbie Anderson and DJ Moore. Those guys can stretch the field, but Bridgewater has shown over the course of his career that he's not willing to throw the ball downfield. The Panthers used 0 of their 7 draft picks on the offense. All 7 of their draft picks went to the defense, and I think this team defensively is going to have a good front 7. I think they have good linebackers. I think they'll get pressure on opposing quarterbacks, but funny thing with pressure is that if your secondary is bad, quarterbacks can get the ball out quickly because receivers can sometimes gain separation a lot quicker than defensive linemen can get to the passer. So I think this is going to be a case where Carolina's defense has a talented front 7 but gives up a lot of yards and a lot of points because their secondary is really poor. The Panthers' starting corners going into this season are Dante Jackson and Eli Apple. I just don't think that's good enough for this Panthers team. I actually like Eli Apple more than most people. I also think Trey Boston and Kenny Robinson Jr. are going to be good safeties for this team. But if you told me that there was a record fantasy performance for a wide receiver, I would guess that it's one of the receivers in the NFC South and they were playing the Carolina Panthers because the Panthers' corners are just so weak. Dante Jackson, Eli Apple, Troy Pride Jr., I don't think this trio is going to be able to match up with Chris Godwin, Mike Evans in Tampa Bay, Michael Thomas, Emmanuel Sanders, Jared Cook, Kamara in New Orleans, and then Julio Jones and Calvin Ridley in Atlanta. I think the Panthers could go 1-5 against the division potentially, and that leaves them pretty vulnerable to hit the under for 5.5 or for 6 wins. So, I think if you're a Panthers fan, you should probably hope that this team is one of the worst in the NFL for next season, just so that you get your choice of one of these quarterback prospects, because the 2021 draft class looks to be a really promising one right now. Moving to the NFC North. So Green Bay is listed at 9 in a lot of places. It was previously at 9.5. It's still at 9.5 in some other places. I don't really feel good about either number at this point. Green Bay is in an interesting spot because last year they won 13 games. They probably should have only won about 9. They really weren't that good of a team, but they won a lot of games. They had a really questionable offseason. Obviously, their draft wasn't great. I don't know how they didn't address receiver throughout one of the most receiver-rich draft classes that we've had in a while. But the bottom line with the Packers is that I actually don't really like the other 3 teams in this division very much. And Green Bay's roster is actually not that bad. There aren't a lot of holes in it. They might not have a great second receiver, but Devontae Adams is a pretty good first guy to have. I don't really like a lot of the components of this team, and I don't think their process has been very good, but I'm worried that even if I kind of instinctually want to bet they're under, they might be a team that just gets more positive feedback despite kind of having a poor process in the offseason. So I'm going to lay off of Green Bay. I think that Green Bay should probably be the favorites in this division, but I don't feel great about it. I also would like to point out that Aaron Rodgers has been, closer to being a fringe top 10 quarterback than a fringe top 5 quarterback the past 2 seasons. He has a really good touchdown to interception ratio, but he's hiding a lot of his negative plays in sacks and throwaways. So this offense hasn't been overwhelmingly efficient, in part because Rodgers hasn't been an elite quarterback. The next team I'll go over is Minnesota. The over-under is 9. So I like the Vikings under. I think they had a really rough free agency period, but they had a good draft. Going over some of the big moves the Vikings made this offseason. I think the Stephon Diggs loss is going to turn out to be a really big one. Diggs was the only guy on this team who could really stretch the field consistently. Opposing defenses would let Thielen take single coverage a lot because teams were very concerned about Stephon Diggs. The good news for the Vikings is that they got, a decent amount of draft capital for Diggs, and they ended up using one of their first-round picks on Justin Jefferson. The problem is that Thielen and Jefferson, to me, have kind of a weird duplication where they're both probably best in the slot, and neither one is that much of a downfield threat. I think this offense is going to be a lot, less efficient because of the loss of Diggs. The other thing to keep in mind is that Kirk Cousins pretty quietly actually had the best season of his career last year in a lot of different ways. If he regresses and if he's not as good in this upcoming year, if he plays more like an average quarterback, which is pretty plausible, I think this offense could be pretty weak actually. The offensive line isn't actually very good if you look at the guys that they're starting. I'm a little bit concerned about this team offensively. And then defensively, despite having, a pretty smart defensive-minded coach in Zimmer, they lost all 3 of their top corners from last year. Now, look, I'll admit Xavier Rhodes was awful last year, so losing him might be more of a benefit. But they also lost Trey Waynes and Mackenzie Alexander. They're replacing those 3 guys with Mike Hughes, who hasn't played much. He was a first-round pick in 2018. Their first-round pick this year, Jeff Gladney, and their third-round pick this year, Cameron Dantzler. Maybe one of those three guys will be pretty good, maybe even two of them, but there's a lot of unproven corners on this team. And overall, I think the defense will probably be fine, but the offense to me is probably going to regress a little bit from where they were last year just because of the Diggs loss and Cousins potentially regressing. So I'm under on the Vikings at 9. I think the NFC is crowded, and I think the Vikings might be surprisingly weak compared to where they were last year. I also like the Vikings minus 105 to miss the playoffs. I know that there are 7 playoff teams this year, but that's almost even money for a team that I think I would say is not one of the 7 best teams in the NFC right now. Next up, the Chicago Bears. They're listed at 8 wins for their over-under. I also saw them at 8.5. Not as recently. They are listed at 8.5 on a few places still. So the same reason why I liked the Bears under a lot last year is why I like their under this year. Their quarterback situation is firmly the worst in the NFC North. Trubisky has been really bad. Like, he has been, I was, anti-Trubisky after the 2018 season because I knew his stats were largely misleading, and he ended up even worse than I thought. And so he's been terrible. The fact that they brought in Nick Foles doesn't really change things for me. Foles has a lot of variance associated with his game, which means that we could see the St. Louis Rams version of Nick Foles with this Bears team. I think the Bears' offensive line is weak. I think other than Allen Robinson, there's not a lot of receivers to get excited about on this team. I think this offense could be easily the worst in this division and probably one of the weakest in the NFC. And so for the people who like the Bears, they're going to point to the defense. My counterpoint is that this defense was good last year and it didn't matter very much. They also lost Prince Amukamara, which to me does matter. I just think this Bears team has a much better chance of being one of the weakest teams in the NFC than one of the best teams in the NFC. I think there's a way more visible pathway for this team to just be really poor. Similar to how the Jacksonville Jaguars declined over the past few seasons despite having one really good splash season where they made the AFC Championship game. Ultimately, Blake Bortles just wasn't good enough, and the same can be said here where Trubisky just is not a starting caliber quarterback at this point. He's nowhere near it, and I just don't think Nick Foles is enough for me to want to bet on this team. I was really surprised that the Bears didn't go after a cheaper quarterback like Jameis Winston or Andy Dalton, even a Cam Newton, where they wouldn't have had to give up a 4th-round pick to acquire one of those other quarterbacks. So the Nick Foles decision was surprising to me, and I don't think it's going to end well in Chicago. So finally, we have the Detroit Lions. Lions over-under is 6.5. So I'm tentatively on the over for this team. I think the Lions actually have the second best roster in this division behind Green Bay. I think Stafford, you could make the case, is the best quarterback in this division, but he's probably right there with Aaron Rodgers at this point. Stafford was playing really well last year before he got injured. The team was 3-4-1 in the games where Stafford started. Of course, they lost every game after he got injured. But I like this Lions team. I think Kenny Golladay and Marvin Jones is an underrated set of receivers. They have Amendola as the slot guy. We'll see what we get out of Hawkinson. The offensive line seems to be around average. My worry about this team is Matt Patricia. I think Patricia is one of the weakest head coaches in the NFL, and head coach is a really important component of any team. If you look at Patricia's resume, when he was the defensive coordinator of the New England Patriots in the 2017 season, that was one of the worst defenses in the Belichick era. He somehow got a head coaching job, and the Lions, for whatever reason, fired Jim Caldwell, who did quietly a very good job with that team. Patricia comes in. He's been awful for 2 years. Stafford was injured last year, so I guess that's why he didn't get fired. My worry with this team is that Patricia will hold them back, and this Lions defense has been awful in the past 2 seasons since Patricia has been there. To go along with that, they play one of the most basic defensive schemes in the NFL. I actually like this Lions defense on paper going into this year. If you look at their secondary, even though they lost Darius Slay, Jeffrey Okudah, Desmond Trufant as the starting outside corners. They have Justin Coleman as a slot corner. They have Amani Oruwariye, who looked reasonable at times last year, as a fourth corner. I think this Lions defense, along with some of the additions they've made in their front seven, is actually relatively talented, and that's why I like this team. But if Patricia holds them back, it's going to be disappointing. I think this team is the second best roster in this division. I'm going over 6.5 wins. Back in February, I was able to get the Lions plus 900 to win their division because I don't particularly like any team in the NFC North. I just thought plus 900 was really absurd considering that the Lions have potentially the best quarterback in this division. That number has since moved down to plus 600, and I still think it's a positive expected value bet. So plus 600 for the Lions to win the NFC North makes a lot of sense to me. Okay, and finally we have the NFC East. This is actually the division that I have the least action on of any division in the NFL. Starting out with the Eagles at 9.5 wins. I'm laying off of this team even though I thought they had a really good offseason. I really liked some of the things they did. They added Darius Slay and Nickel Roby-Coleman to their secondary, and their secondary has been the weak point of this team for the past couple seasons. It's great to see that they finally addressed it. They added Kayvon Wallace and Davion Taylor, a couple of pretty versatile defensive players in this past draft. I thought they got both those guys for good bargains. I thought they were both worth second-round picks. Davion Taylor was taken in the 3rd round. Kayvon Wallace was taken in the 4th round. To go along with that, the Eagles added a lot of speed to their offense. They drafted Jalen Reagor, John Hightower, and Quez Watkins. All 3 of those players are speedy downfield threats. Deshaun Jackson is coming back, and on top of that, they traded for Marquise Goodwin. So this team is probably going to have multiple deep threats on the field at the same time for a lot of the upcoming season. That'll open up things for the best tight end duo in the NFL with Dallas Goedert and Zach Ertz. And on top of that, I think they have a pretty good offensive line even without Brandon Brooks. I like Doug Peterson as a head coach, and I generally like this Eagles team. With all of that being said, 9.5 feels like a no play for me because I don't necessarily trust Carson Wentz to stay healthy. This team has won 9 games in each of the past 2 seasons, in large part due to injuries, and it hasn't always been Wentz who's gotten injured, but Wentz has been injured a lot in a short amount of time in his NFL career. I think his injuries are more chronic than they are random, and because of that, I'm going to avoid the Eagles at 9.5. I think that the right move for Philadelphia might be to bet on something more long-term, like their Super Bowl odds. But for now, I'm going to lay off of the Eagles, even though I generally like what they've done. The Cowboys are also at 9.5. Another team that I think had a really good offseason. I think Mike McCarthy is going to be a big improvement from Jason Garrett. Their draft was good. I thought the CeeDee Lamb and Trayvon Diggs picks were a very good 1st and 2nd round combination. They kept Kellen Moore, who was a real plus as a play caller for the offense last year. And I'm not super concerned about their loss of Byron Jones. I think the defense is going to be around average. They signed some lower tier corners like Daryl Worley and Anthony Brown to kind of fill in, along with Trayvon Diggs. So I think they'll be able to kind of string together an okay defense. It won't be elite, but it'll be probably good enough. I think offensively this team's going to be good, but 9.5 is a relatively big number, and it's juiced heavily towards the over, so you have to pay a lot to play. I'm going to lay off of the Cowboys as well. So the third team in this division is the New York Giants at 6.5. This is the third team that I am laying off of in this NFC East. I don't really see any value anywhere with this Giants team. My first instinct was to go with the under because I don't really like Daniel Jones that much. He had one of the worst interceptable pass rates in the NFL last year. He also fumbled an enormous amount of times. I think he had 1.5 fumbles per game last season. Not all of them were lost, of course, but just the act of dropping the football in the game. Daniel Jones really struggled. The positives with Jones is that he's got a lot of upside. He did have a few really big performances, but I still feel pretty confident that Jones is in the bottom third of quarterbacks in the NFL. And the only reason why I'm not hitting the under on this is because we don't know a lot about the Giants' new head coach, Joe Judge. In fact, he's probably the coach that we know the least about in the entire NFL. But very quietly, the Giants, for the first time in a few seasons, had a good draft. I don't know if that was Judge kind of influencing Gettleman, but this Giants team actually had a pretty good draft. Just looking at the Giants roster, the offensive line is competent. The receiving core is competent. Defensively, I still think there are some question marks, but they added some pieces and they're probably going to be better. I think 6.5 is the right number, and I'm just going to lay off the Giants for now. Finally, we have the Washington Redskins. I don't know if their name is going to be the Redskins for the upcoming season, but whatever. We'll just call them that for now. They have an over-under of 5.5 wins. I don't feel great about this, but I'm leaning a little bit towards the over. This is the only team where I have an edge, I feel like, one way or the other in this division. So they add Ron Rivera as a head coach. I think he's an average-ish head coach, so there's a pretty good chance he'll help them win more games than they probably otherwise would have. Dwayne Haskins is someone who I thought was pretty uninspiring in his first season, but with that being said, Terry McLaurin was really special in his first year. I think McLaurin looks like a better, more versatile version of Brandon Cooks. I think McLaurin is one of the 12 best receivers in the NFL right now. Unfortunately, there's not a lot of weapons outside of him. They drafted Antonio Gibson. They drafted Antonio Gandy-Golden. The offensive line probably, maybe average, maybe a little below that. They did get a draft pick for the future for Trent Williams. I think in general, this offense is probably going to struggle, and they won't be that great. Defensively, the front seven is actually pretty talented. They've stockpiled a lot of blue-chip prospects in their front seven. The problem is that their secondary is very weak, and, they traded Quinton Dunbar. They lost Josh Norman in free agency. The new corners are going to be Kendall Fuller and Ronald Darby. I think that has the potential to be atrocious, but it also, if regression works in their favor, it could be competent. Those are a couple of players who have had some big fluctuations over the course of their careers. So 5.5 is a pretty low number. I don't feel great about it. I'm going to lean towards the over. If you could get the Redskins at 5, I think it makes more sense to go with the over. But yeah, I don't feel great about it. I'm going to lean slightly over on the Washington Redskins. So that's all for this episode of the Athletic Acuity Sports Podcast. Keep in mind that there is a twin podcast to this one where I go over the AFC team over-unders and bets that I like. If you're interested, thanks for listening.